At my father's funeral, a stranger handed me an envelope and said, "Your mother told me to wait." The woman found me by the coat stand, just after the service, while I was still fumbling with the top button of my coat and trying to remember which of my father's colleagues I still needed to thank for coming. She was perhaps 70, small and precisely dressed, with the kind of stillness that makes a person seem taller than they are, and she placed a plain cream envelope into my hands with the particular care of someone handling something breakable. "You won't know me," she said. "My name is Constance Whitmore. I was your mother's closest friend, many years ago, before you'd have been old enough to remember me properly. She asked me to give you this, on the day your father was buried, and not one day before. I've kept it in a drawer for 15 years, Verity, and I have to tell you, it has been the longest 15 years of my life, waiting to finally put it in your hands." I looked down at the envelope. My name was written across the front in handwriting I had not seen in 15 years, handwriting I would have known anywhere, in any lifetime, because it was the same hand that had written my name inside the cover of every birthday card I owned before I turned 19. My mother's handwriting. My mother, who had been dead for 15 years, had somehow reached across all that time to hand me something on the exact day my father was lowered into the ground beside her. "I don't understand," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, standing there in the November cold outside St. Aldhelm's with mourners filing past us toward their cars. "My mother's been gone 15 years. How could she have known when my father would die?" "She didn't," Constance said. "She simply knew, better than anyone, exactly what would need to be true before you could safely hear what's in that envelope. She told me, very plainly, the last time I saw her alive, that it had to wait until Edmund was gone. I didn't fully understand why, not then. I do now, and I think, once you've read it, you will too. My name is Verity Calloway. I am 34 years old, and on the day I buried my father, I discovered that my mother had spent the final months of her life orchestrating a message that would not reach me until 15 years after her death. I want to tell you what was in that envelope, and everything I learned trying to understand it, but first I need to tell you what I believed, right up until that November afternoon, about the two people who raised me, because almost none of it turned out to be entirely true. I grew up believing my mother, Miriam Calloway, had been an unwell woman for most of my adolescence, and that my father, Dr. Edmund Calloway, a respected GP with a long, distinguished career at a practice in Cheltenham, had been the steady, patient husband who cared for her through it, right up until her death from cancer when I was 19. This was the story told to me, gently and repeatedly, from the time I was around 14, that my mother, once a genuinely gifted concert pianist who had trained at the Royal College of Music and performed, in her 20s, in halls across Europe, had begun to suffer from what my father called, in careful, clinical language, an early and progressive cognitive decline, a decline that made her forgetful, erratic, prone to confusion and, on her worst days, to a kind of frightened, disoriented weeping that I, as a teenager, found almost unbearable to witness. I remember my father sitting me down in his study when I was 15, the year her symptoms seemed to worsen most sharply, and saying, with the particular gravity he brought to everything, "Your mother isn't the woman she was, Verity, and I need you to understand that isn't her fault, and it isn't a reflection of how much she loves you. Her mind is unwell in a way medicine can manage but not undo. I need you to be patient with her, and I need you to let me handle the difficult decisions, because they aren't decisions a child should have to carry." I was patient with her. I want that on record, because I have spent a great deal of time since that November funeral forgiving myself for not being patient enough, and I think it matters to say plainly that I was, by any reasonable measure, a good daughter to a mother I believed was slowly disappearing in front of me. I sat with her on her difficult days. I learned to recognize the particular quality of her confusion and to speak to her slowly and gently through it, the way my father had taught me. I grieved her, in small pieces, for years, long before she actually died, because I believed I was watching a brilliant woman's mind dissolve in real time, and there is a particular, exhausting grief in loving someone through a decline you believe to be irreversible. What I did not know, what I could not have known, sitting in that study at 15 believing every careful word my father said, was that the woman disappearing in front of me was not disappearing at all. She was being made to appear that way, slowly and with great precision, by the very man who was telling me to be patient with her illness. There is one memory in particular I have returned to more than any other since that November, a memory I spent years filing under sadness and now understand belongs, instead, under evidence. I was 16, and my mother had been invited, by an old colleague from her Royal College days, to give a short recital at a charity concert in Cheltenham, one of the few public performances she gave in those later years. She had practiced for weeks, more focused and more like her old self than I had seen her in months, and I remember feeling, watching her rehearse in the front room, a flicker of the mother I half remembered from earlier childhood, sharp and quick and entirely present. The night of the concert, she faltered twice during a Chopin nocturne, small hesitations that would have gone almost unnoticed in a less accomplished pianist, and I remember my father, in the car afterward, saying gently, almost tenderly, "You did wonderfully, darling, given everything," a sentence that managed, in 6 words, to turn a genuinely creditable performance into further proof of her decline. I remember my mother going very quiet in the passenger seat, and I remember thinking, at 16, how patient my father was being with her disappointment in herself. I understand now, reading her diary, that those 2 small hesitations had nothing to do with any cognitive decline at all. She had, that same week, been prescribed what my father described to her as something to help with the anxiety of performing again, a medication I now know, cross-referenced against her own careful notes, was never intended for performance anxiety at all, and which left her hands, for several hours afterward, subtly slower to respond than her mind. She had known, sitting at that piano, that something was wrong with her own coordination that had nothing to do with age or illness. She simply had no way, that night, to prove it to anyone, including herself. I did not open the envelope at the funeral. I want to be honest about why, because I think it says something true about who I am, and who my mother, it turned out, had always correctly understood me to be. Constance Whitmore had driven 40 minutes to place that envelope in my hands, and part of me wanted, desperately, to tear it open right there among the departing mourners and the smell of chrysanthemums, but a larger part of me understood that whatever my mother had waited 15 years to tell me deserved to be received somewhere quiet, without an audience, without the added complication of my father's colleagues watching my face for a reaction. "Will you have tea with me, once you're ready?" Constance asked, pressing a card with her telephone number into my other hand. There's a great deal I can tell you that isn't written down, and I think, once you've read what's inside, you'll have questions only I can answer. I told her I would ring her within the week, and I meant it, though it took me 3 days to actually work up the courage to open the envelope at all. I drove home from the funeral, made arrangements for the small gathering of family friends that followed, accepted condolences from people who had known my father for decades and spoke of him, uniformly, as a devoted husband who had cared selflessly for a wife lost to illness, and I said nothing, that whole difficult afternoon, about the cream envelope sitting in my handbag, because I did not yet know what it contained, and some careful instinct told me not to speak of it until I did. I opened it on the Tuesday evening, alone, at my kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold beside me exactly the way it had at every difficult kitchen table conversation of my adult life, and I read, in my mother's handwriting, growing slightly less steady toward the final page, the letter she had written for me in the last months before she died. My darling Verity, if Constance has done as I've asked, you are reading this after your father has died, and I am sorry, more than I can properly say, that I could not simply tell you this while I was alive myself. I want you to understand, before anything else, that keeping this from you all these years was not a failure of love. It was, I believe, the only way I could protect you from a battle I did not think either of us could win while your father was alive and in control of everything that mattered, the money, the doctors, the story everyone believed about me. You have grown up believing I was unwell, Verity, and I need you to know, as clearly as I can write it, that I was not unwell in the way you were told. I was being medicated, slowly and with great care taken to make the process look natural, by your father, a man with full and legitimate access to prescribing authority and to my own private medical records, in doses calculated to produce exactly the symptoms he then described to you, to our doctors, and eventually to the courts, as evidence of a progressive cognitive decline. I do not know precisely when it began. I know that it began not long after I discovered, in my own quiet way, that the trust my own mother had left me, nearly £400,000, inherited outright and never legally shared with your father, had begun to be drawn upon for what he called household expenses that I could not, however hard I tried, account for in any of our actual household spending. I raised it with him once, calmly, the way I raised everything with him, because I had learned, by then, that raising things any other way only made him colder. He told me I was confused. It was the first time he ever used that particular word about me, and I remember it precisely, because within a year, it had become the word everyone used about me, including, eventually, you. I had to stop reading at that point, and sit for a long while with my cold tea and my racing pulse, before I could bring myself to continue. I want to tell you honestly that my first instinct, reading those paragraphs, was not fury, though fury arrived later, in careful, measured waves over the following weeks. My first instinct was a kind of vertigo, the sensation of an entire childhood rearranging itself behind my eyes, every memory of my mother's confusion, her tears, her frightened disorientation, suddenly wearing a completely different meaning than the one I had carried for 15 years. I made myself a fresh cup of tea, because I have learned, over difficult years, that my hands need something to do when my mind is doing something this large, and I returned to the letter. I want to tell you, Verity, exactly how I came to understand what was happening to me, because I think it matters that you know I was not simply a passive victim in all of this, even though for a long time I felt entirely powerless. I began, quietly, keeping a diary in the autumn you turned 14, not of my feelings, but of facts, the dates and doses of every medication your father gave me, cross-referenced, where I could manage it, against what I could learn, through careful and cautious questions to our pharmacist, about what had actually been prescribed. The discrepancies were small at first, and then, over about 18 months, considerably less small. I also began, in that same autumn, quietly writing to my sister Rosalind, your Aunt Rosalind, whom you have likely never met, because your father made it very clear, early in our marriage, that her influence on me was unhelpful, and over the years, I am ashamed to say, I let that judgment slowly separate us, the way water separates two things that were once joined. So gradually you barely notice the gap widening until it has become a gulf. I wrote to her again, in secret, in those final years, and she kept my letters, all of them, because I asked her to, in case they were ever needed as evidence of what I was actually experiencing, rather than what I was being told I was experiencing. I want you to go and see her, Verity, when you are ready. Her address is enclosed. She has been waiting a very long time to meet the daughter she has only ever seen in old photographs. I rang Constance Whitmore the following evening, because the letter, remarkable and devastating as it was, left me with considerably more questions than answers, and Constance, I understood, had been waiting 15 years for precisely this call. We met at her cottage outside Cheltenham, a small, book-lined house that smelled of wood smoke and old paper, and she made tea with the unhurried competence of a woman who had clearly done this exact thing, comforting someone through a difficult conversation, many times over a long life. "Your mother and I met at the Royal College," she told me, settling into a chair across from mine. "We were roommates for 2 years before either of us married. I went into law, and she went on to have a career I genuinely believe could have been extraordinary, had it not been cut short. I want you to understand that, Verity, before anything else. Your mother was not a fragile woman who happened to become unwell. She was one of the most formidable people I have ever known, and it took a very patient, very calculated campaign to make the rest of the world believe otherwise. I watched it happen, you know," Constance said, setting down her teacup with a care that suggested the memory still cost her something, even after all these years. "Slowly enough that I kept doubting my own eyes. She'd ring me, in the early years, sharp and funny as ever, and then, over time, the calls became shorter, more hesitant, as though she was checking each sentence before she let herself say it. I asked Edmund about it once, at a dinner party, quite directly, whether he was concerned about how quickly she seemed to be changing. He looked at me with such gentle, patient sorrow, Verity, and said, 'It's a cruel thing to watch, isn't it, Constance? I'm doing everything medicine allows.' I remember driving home that night convinced I'd been unfair to even ask." "You believed him," I said, not as an accusation, simply as a fact I needed to hear her confirm. "For a long time, yes. He was extraordinarily convincing, and he had the authority of his profession behind every word. It wasn't until the diary that I understood how carefully that authority had been used against her, appointment by appointment, sentence by sentence, until believing him had become the path of least resistance for everyone around her, myself included." "Why didn't she leave him?" I asked, because it was the question that had been sitting hardest in my chest since Tuesday. If she knew, if she was keeping a diary, why did she stay? Constance was quiet for a moment, choosing her words with obvious care. "Because by the time she was certain enough to act, he had already arranged for power of attorney over her affairs, obtained, on paper, entirely properly, with 2 doctors' signatures, doctors who had only ever seen her through the lens of symptoms your father himself had described to them in advance of every appointment. She told me once that trying to prove her own competence, to doctors who had already been told, by a respected colleague, what to expect from her, felt like trying to prove you weren't drowning while someone held your head under the water and asked, quite reasonably, why you seemed so short of breath." I sat with that image for a long time, feeling something in my chest that was not quite anger yet, more like the early tremor before an earthquake properly begins. "She did leave him, eventually, in the way that was actually available to her," Constance continued. "Not through a solicitor, because she no longer had the legal standing to instruct one without his knowledge, but through me, and through her sister, and through that diary, which she gave to me for safekeeping 4 months before she died, along with a letter she made me swear not to deliver until Edmund himself was gone." "Why wait so long?" I asked. "If she had evidence, why not use it while she was still alive, to get herself free of him properly?" "Because by then, Verity, she was dying of something else entirely, something no manipulation of medication could be blamed for or hidden behind, ovarian cancer, diagnosed far too late, partly, I believe, because by the time she began describing symptoms that were entirely real and entirely serious, everyone around her, including her own oncologist, initially treated her complaints with the same weary skepticism your father had spent years cultivating. She told me, near the end, that she no longer had the strength left to fight 2 battles at once, the cancer, and the truth about your father. She chose the one she thought would actually let her leave this world with some dignity intact, and she entrusted the second battle to time, and to you, once you were old enough and safe enough to fight it properly. Safe enough, I repeated. Safe from what, exactly? From him, Verity. She was terrified, genuinely terrified, of what your father might do if the truth came out while he still had legal and financial control over both of you. She used to say, and I remember this precisely because it chilled me at the time, he has spent years teaching everyone that I cannot be believed. If I try to tell the truth now, while he's still standing there controlling every account and every doctor's opinion, they'll simply add, and now she's accusing her devoted husband of poisoning her, to the list of things proving how unwell I am. I need Verity to be an adult, with her own resources and her own standing, before she hears this, because I need her to be believed, and I need her to have somewhere solid to stand while she processes it, and I cannot give her that while he's alive and I'm not. I understood, hearing that, precisely why the envelope had waited 15 years. And I felt, for the first time since Tuesday evening, something shift from vertigo into a kind of settled, cold clarity. I did not confront my father's memory, or the people who had known him, in any dramatic way over the following weeks. I want to be honest that I considered it, in my angrier moments, imagined standing up at some future memorial gathering and announcing, to a room full of his admiring former colleagues, exactly what kind of man they had actually spent decades praising. I did not do that, and I want to explain why, because I think it is the most important choice in this entire story. My mother had spent her final months protecting me from exactly this kind of premature, unstrategic confrontation, one that would have cost me credibility and cost her memory the very vindication she had waited so patiently to secure. I decided, sitting with Constance's account and my mother's diary, that I owed her the same patience she had shown, gathering the truth carefully, methodically, before I did anything with it at all. I went, first, to see my Aunt Rosalind, a warm, sharp-eyed woman living in a village outside Bath who wept openly when I appeared at her door, unannounced, on a grey December afternoon. "I've kept every letter your mother ever sent me," she said, once we were settled with tea in her small, book-cluttered sitting room. I always believed her, Verity, from the very first letter. I want you to know that, because I think it matters, hearing it from someone who never once doubted her, even when everyone else in the family had been told, quite convincingly, that she couldn't be trusted. She showed me the letters, dozens of them, spanning nearly 6 years, documenting in Miriam's own increasingly careful, increasingly frightened hand, the exact slow erosion Constance had described, medication discrepancies, doctors who seemed to have already formed their opinions before she'd said a word, a husband who grew colder and more controlling with each year that her supposed decline deepened, and a trust fund that dwindled, steadily and unaccountably, under an arrangement of power of attorney my mother had, by the final years, no meaningful ability to challenge. She read one letter aloud to me, that first afternoon, her voice unsteady in places, dated the autumn I turned 17. "Rosalind, I timed it again today. 2 hours after the morning tablet, my hands wouldn't hold a teacup steady, and by evening I was myself again entirely. I have written the times down. I do not know yet what I intend to do with this information, only that I intend to have it, in case the day comes when I need proof of what my own body already knows to be true." Rosalind folded the letter carefully back into its envelope when she finished, and said, "She sent me a version of that same observation perhaps a dozen times over 4 years, each one a little more precise, a little more careful, as though she was building a case brick by brick, all on her own, with no one but me to hand the bricks to. There's something else you should know," Rosalind said, near the end of that first visit, watching my face carefully as she said it. "Your father didn't simply spend that money on household expenses, whatever he told your mother." I did some looking, myself, over the years, quietly, because I couldn't do much else for her from this distance. He used a substantial portion of it, Verity, to fund the very practice reputation everyone in Cheltenham still speaks of so admiringly. The equipment upgrades that made his surgery so well regarded. The professional memberships. Even, I believe, a portion of the funding for the Community Health Award he received, the year before your mother died, an award given, in no small part, for his exceptional dedication to caring for a wife with complex health needs. I sat very still, absorbing the particular, cruel irony of it, that my father had not simply stolen from my mother's fortune while telling the world she was unwell. He had used her own money to build the very reputation for saintly devotion that made her impossible to be believed. I should say something here about my husband, James, an architect I had married 6 years earlier, and who watched me, over those first difficult weeks, absorb the entire rearrangement of my own childhood without ever once trying to hurry my process along. He came with me, some evenings, simply to sit in the next room while I read through another section of the diary, not asking questions, only remaining present in case I needed him to be. I keep waiting to feel ready to talk about it properly, I told him one night, closing the diary after a particularly difficult passage. And I don't think I am yet, and I don't know when I will be. Then don't be, yet, he said, simply. You don't owe anyone, including me, a tidy version of this before you've actually finished feeling it. Take whatever time it takes. I'm not going anywhere. I have thought, often since, about how different that year might have looked with a partner less willing to sit quietly in an adjoining room, asking nothing, offering nothing except steady presence, and I understood, watching him, something of what my mother had never had, someone in her corner who was simply, uncomplicatedly, on her side. James asked me once, quite late in that first year, whether I ever resented my mother for waiting so long, for choosing patience over immediate action even at the cost of never living to see the truth land safely. I thought about it seriously before I answered, because it was a fair question, and one I had asked myself in my angrier moments. No, I told him, finally. I think if she'd tried to fight him properly while she was alive, with the power of attorney already signed away and every doctor already primed to doubt her, she'd have lost, and losing publicly would have only added another chapter to his story about her instability. I think what she actually did, waiting, trusting me with it when I'd finally have the standing to be believed, was the single bravest and most strategic thing available to her. It cost her the chance to see it resolved herself. I think she decided that cost was worth paying, if it meant I'd actually win. That's an extraordinary thing to have done for someone, James said. 15 years of trusting a plan you'd never live to see finished. I think that's simply what real love looks like, sometimes, I said. Not the dramatic, immediate kind. The kind that's willing to wait 15 years in a drawer, in an envelope, for the exact right moment to finally do some good. I want to pause the story here to tell you about the part of this process that surprised me most, which was not the depth of my father's deception, terrible as it was, but the depth of my own guilt, arriving in waves I had not anticipated, over the following weeks. I had spent years being gently, patiently kind to a mother I believed was disappearing, and I had, without ever meaning to, absorbed my father's framing of her entirely. I had thought of her, privately, in my most honest teenage moments, as a burden, a sadness, a woman I loved but occasionally, guiltily, wished I did not have to manage the confusion of. I had believed her tears were symptoms. I had believed her occasional moments of sharp, lucid anger, which I now understood, reading her diary, were entirely rational responses to being slowly poisoned and disbelieved, were simply further evidence of her decline. I sat with my counselor, a calm, unhurried woman named Dr. Alders whom I began seeing that December, and told her, I think what I feel most, underneath the anger, is shame. I spent years being patient with my mother's illness, and it turns out what she actually needed from me wasn't patience. It was belief. And I didn't know how to give her that, because I'd already been taught, very thoroughly, not to. You were 14, Dr. Alders said, gently. You were given a story by the person you had every reasonable childhood right to trust, and you believed it, the way children generally do believe their parents. That isn't a failure of love, Verity. That's simply what happens to a child raised inside a very carefully constructed deception. The failure, if there was one, belongs entirely to the person who built it. I remember one session with Dr. Alders in particular, some weeks later, when I finally said aloud something I had been circling for weeks. I keep thinking about a specific afternoon, I told her. I was maybe 16, and she'd forgotten, or seemed to forget, that she'd already told me a story twice that same week, and I remember feeling this flash of impatience, and saying, rather sharply, "You already told me that, Mum," and watching her face crumple, just slightly, before she apologized to me. I keep replaying it. I keep wanting to go back and simply listen to the story a third time without making her feel ashamed of repeating it. What would you say to 16-year-old you, if you could? Dr. Alders asked. I thought about it for a long moment. I'd tell her it wasn't her fault for believing what every adult in the house had told her to believe. I'd tell her the sharpness wasn't cruelty, it was exhaustion, and exhaustion is allowed, even toward people we love, even when the exhaustion turns out to have been manufactured by someone else entirely. And I think I'd tell her that her mother forgave that moment completely, long before either of them had any idea what was actually happening, because that's simply the kind of person her mother was underneath everything he did to obscure it. Do you believe that? Dr. Alders asked. I'm starting to, I said, and I found, saying it aloud, that it was, for the first time, almost entirely true. I have returned to that sentence often since, because I think it is true, and because I think believing it, fully, was the necessary first step toward whatever came next. I went back to the house once, alone, before it was eventually sold, to sort through what remained of my parents' belongings, and I found, in a box at the back of my mother's old wardrobe, something that undid me more completely than the diary itself had managed to, a small stack of concert programs, carefully kept, from performances she had given in her 20s, before I existed, before my father, before any of it, each one annotated in the margins in her own hand with tiny, private notes. To herself, nerves better tonight, remember to breathe through the second movement, B minor section still too rushed, practice slower, the ordinary, hopeful working notes of a young woman entirely confident in her own competence, entirely unafraid of her own mind. I sat on the floor of that wardrobe for a long time, holding those programs, and I understood, more completely than any diary entry had managed to convey, exactly what had been taken from her, not simply money, not simply years, but the quiet, unremarkable certainty of trusting her own hands, her own memory, her own account of her own experience, a certainty she had once possessed so completely she'd bothered to write herself reminders about breathing through a difficult passage, rather than reminders about whether she could trust what she was hearing at all. I kept the programs. I did not keep very much else from that house, in the end, beyond the piano itself, which I had moved, at some expense, into my own front room, where it now sits exactly where I can see it each morning while I have my tea, the way, I imagine, my mother once sat somewhere she could see hers. The second major discovery, the one that reshaped my understanding of my father's death itself, came nearly 2 months after the funeral, when his solicitor, a careful, precise man named Mr. Aldous Fenn, invited me to his office to discuss the estate. Your father's will is, on its surface, quite straightforward, he told me, sliding a folder across his desk. The house passes to you outright. His personal savings and investments, considerably diminished from what they once were, I should say, also pass to you. But the bulk of what remains of his estate, some £600,000, has been left in trust to establish something he called, in the will's language, the Callaway Foundation for Compassionate Care, intended to fund training for GPs supporting patients with complex cognitive health needs, administered by a board he named himself, 3 former colleagues from his practice. I sat very still, understanding, with a clarity that felt almost physically painful, exactly what my father had done. He had taken what remained of a fortune that had originated, in significant part, from my mother's own inheritance, money he had drawn down for years under a false story of her illness, and arranged, even in death, to spend the remainder cementing that same false story permanently, a foundation, bearing his name, dedicated to precisely the kind of compassionate care he had never actually provided her, funded by the very money he had taken while pretending to provide it. The forensic accountant Mr. Fenn engaged, a methodical, unhurried man named Owen Price, spent nearly 4 months tracing the money, and I remember the afternoon he finally laid the full picture out across Mr. Fenn's conference table, a timeline stretching back nearly 2 decades, showing, year by year, precisely how much of the trust my mother's own mother had left her had been drawn down, and precisely how much of that drawn down sum could be matched, almost pound for pound, against specific improvements to my father's practice, professional memberships, and, in the final years, direct contributions to the very foundation he would eventually name after himself. I want to be clear about something, Owen said, tapping the final page of the timeline. This isn't ambiguous. A less careful man might have blurred these figures enough to make the connection deniable. Your father, I think, never expected anyone to look this closely, because he never expected your mother to be believed enough for anyone to bother looking at all. How does that make you feel, doing this kind of work? I asked him, curious, because he had clearly done it with a precision that went beyond simple professional duty. He was quiet for a moment. My own mother spent years being told by my father that her memory couldn't be trusted, long before anyone had a proper word for what he was doing to her. I never got to prove it, the way you're proving this. I suppose I take a certain grim satisfaction in helping other people finish what my own family never managed to. It was the only moment, across 4 months of careful, patient work, that he said anything personal at all, and I did not press him further, understanding, by then, exactly how much some truths cost the people who finally speak them. Is there any way to challenge this? I asked Mr. Fenn, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. There may well be, he said, carefully, particularly given what you've described to me about the origin of a substantial portion of these funds, and about the circumstances surrounding your mother's diagnosis and the power of attorney arrangement. I'd want to review your mother's diary, and Mrs. Whitmore's account, and your aunt's correspondence, in full, before advising you properly. But I want to say, Verity, that a legal challenge of this kind can take years, and can become, in its own way, a second decade lost to your father's story rather than your mother's. I'd encourage you to think carefully about what outcome you're actually seeking, before we decide how hard to pursue it. I thought about that question for a long time over the following weeks, and I want to tell you honestly that the version of myself who first opened that envelope at my kitchen table would probably have wanted nothing less than my father's entire posthumous reputation dismantled, publicly and completely, his foundation exposed, his former colleagues forced to confront exactly what they had spent decades admiring. But I had watched my mother, in her own letter, choose patience and strategy over immediate vindication, even at the cost of dying before she ever received it, and I found, sitting with Mr. Fenn's question, that I did not actually want a decade-long legal war fought in my father's name, keeping his story, rather than my mother's, at the center of my life for years to come. What I wanted, I realized, was considerably quieter, and I think, in the end, considerably more powerful. I instructed Mr. Fenn to pursue a targeted, limited challenge, not to destroy the Foundation's funding entirely, but to redirect its purpose and its name, using the clear evidence of coercive control and financial manipulation my mother had so carefully documented. It took the better part of a year, working with Mr. Fenn, with Constance as a witness to the diary's provenance, and with a forensic accountant who confirmed, methodically and without any drama at all, precisely how much of the Foundation's funding could be traced back to my mother's original trust. The result, reached eventually through a quiet settlement with the Foundation's board rather than a public trial, neither I nor, I suspect, my father's former colleagues actually wanted, was this: the Callaway Foundation for Compassionate Care was renamed the Miriam Ashworth Foundation, its funding redirected specifically toward supporting patients, and particularly women, who had experienced medical gaslighting and coercive control within their own families, precisely the harm my mother herself had suffered and never lived to see properly named. The 3 board members, none of whom I believe had any knowledge of the money's true origin, agreed to the change without significant resistance, once shown the evidence, and one of them, an older doctor named Dr. Whitby, who had known my mother slightly, before her decline, wrote me a private letter afterward saying simply, "I should have looked more closely, all those years ago, at how quickly and completely Edmund's account of her became the only account anyone considered. I am sorry, Verity, for the part my incuriosity played in that." Dr. Whitby, the older board member who later wrote me that quiet letter of regret, asked to meet me in person before the settlement was finalized, an encounter I agreed to more out of curiosity than any need for his apology. He was in his 70s by then, still sharp, and visibly uncomfortable in a way I found, at least, more honest than my father had ever managed to be. "I want you to understand something, before you decide what to think of me," he said, across a small table in a quiet hotel lounge. "I examined your mother twice, in a professional capacity, in the years before her death, both times at Edmund's request, both times with his detailed notes on her episodes already in front of me before she'd said a single word. I asked her, both times, fairly standard questions, and both times she answered them competently enough that I nearly wrote no significant concerns in my notes. I didn't, in the end, because Edmund's account was so detailed, so consistent, so clearly the account of a devoted husband who knew his wife intimately, that I told myself my own brief impression must simply be missing something he, with decades of daily observation, could see more clearly. I have thought about that decision more than almost any other in my career, since Mr. Fenn's letter arrived. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because I think you deserve to know that not everyone around your mother was fooled entirely without a flicker of doubt. Some of us had the flicker, and silenced it anyway, because trusting a respected colleague's carefully constructed story was so very much easier than trusting our own uncertain instincts. I am not asking you to forgive that. I am simply no longer willing to let it go unspoken. I did not seek out my father's remaining colleagues or friends to tell them what I had learned. I let the Foundation's quiet renaming speak for itself, to those who cared to notice, and I decided, deliberately, not to spend my energy correcting every dinner party where his name might still be spoken admiringly by people who had never had reason to doubt him. I found, to my own surprise, that I did not need every person who had ever respected my father to understand what I now understood. I needed, instead, to build a life in which his version of events no longer had any power over how I saw myself, or my mother, or the 15 years I had spent grieving a woman I had never fully been allowed to know. I grew close to Aunt Rosalind over that year, in a way that felt, increasingly, like recovering something I had been quietly starved of for 2 decades without ever having language for the hunger. She told me stories about my mother I had never heard, her fierce, funny competitiveness as a young pianist, her habit of practicing scales at impossible speed simply to make Rosalind laugh, the particular way she used to hum under her breath while cooking, a habit I discovered, to my own quiet astonishment, that I had apparently inherited without ever knowing where it came from. I began, that spring, taking piano lessons myself, for the first time since I was a child, not to become accomplished, but simply to sit at an instrument my mother had loved and let my own hands learn, slowly and imperfectly, something of what hers had once known fluently. My teacher, a patient young woman named Freya, asked me once, several months in, why I had taken it up so seriously at 34, and I told her, honestly, I think I'm trying to meet my mother somewhere she can't be argued with. Music doesn't lie about who she actually was. Everything else in my childhood, it turned out, did. I want to tell you about the last conversation I had with Constance Whitmore before I finish this story, because I think it captures, better than anything else, the shape of the peace I eventually found. We met for tea again, nearly 18 months after that first November afternoon by the coat stand, and she asked me, carefully, whether I had any regrets about how I had chosen to handle everything, the quiet legal settlement rather than public exposure, the decision not to confront my father's old colleagues directly, the choice to let the truth surface on its own gradual terms rather than force it into the open all at once. None, I told her, and I meant it completely. I thought, for a while, that justice for my mother meant making sure everyone who ever admired my father understood exactly what he'd done. I've come to think justice for her actually meant something quieter than that. It meant believing her, finally, completely, and building something honest out of the wreckage of what he built on lies. I think she'd have preferred a foundation that actually helps women like her, quietly and for decades to come, over one dramatic afternoon of public humiliation for a man who's no longer here to feel it anyway. Constance smiled, the first fully unguarded smile I had seen from her since we met. She always did prefer the long, patient repair to the short, satisfying fight, she said. I think that's precisely why she trusted you with all of this in the first place, Verity. She knew, even watching you grow up under Edmund's version of events, exactly what kind of woman you'd become once you were finally free to become her, rather than the daughter he needed you to be. The foundation held its first proper public event under its new name that following spring, a small recital in the same Cheltenham Hall where my mother had once faltered through a Chopin nocturne under the fog of a medication she never needed. I asked Freya, my piano teacher, whether she thought I might play something myself, just a short, simple piece, and she agreed, gently insisting I choose something I could genuinely manage rather than something that might impress anyone. I played a short prelude my mother had loved, badly in places, my hands nowhere near as steady as hers had once been even on her worst medicated evenings, and I did not mind the imperfection at all, because I understood, sitting at that piano in front of a small audience of women the foundation had already begun to help, that I was not there to prove anything to anyone who had ever doubted her. I was there simply to give her back, publicly and without apology, a stage she had once been quietly, cruelly denied the full use of. Rosalind sat in the front row, and Constance beside her, and James just behind, and afterward, over tea in the hall's small side room, a woman I had never met approached me, perhaps 40, with the particular careful stillness I had come to recognize in people who had lived, for years, inside someone else's version of their own reality. I read about the foundation's story in the local paper, she said. I don't think I would have found the courage to leave, if I hadn't read that your own mother had once been exactly where I was, and that someone, eventually, believed her completely, even if it came too late for her to see it happen. I wanted you to know that. I did not know what to say to that, not immediately, so I simply took her hand for a moment, the way Constance had once taken mine at a coat stand outside a church, and said, "I'm glad you're here. That's all that matters now." I am 36 now, nearly 2 years on from the afternoon a stranger pressed an envelope into my hands outside a church. I still see Rosalind most months. I still play the piano, badly but with genuine joy, most evenings. The Miriam Ashworth Foundation has, in its first full year under its new name and its new purpose, funded support programs for over 300 women navigating exactly the kind of coercive control my mother endured largely alone, and I sit on its board now myself, not out of any need to keep my father's story alive, but because I want my mother's name to keep doing, quietly and steadily, the good her own life was never allowed to finish doing. I did not get revenge on my father, not in any way a more dramatic version of this story might have delivered. I did not stand up at a funeral and denounce him. I did not spend a decade in court dismantling his reputation piece by public piece. I chose, instead, the slower, quieter work my mother had trusted me to be capable of, all those years before I ever knew I was being trusted with anything at all, gathering the truth carefully, believing it fully, and building something honest and lasting out of what remained, rather than burning down what was left simply to watch it fall. I think of my mother often, at the piano, in Rosalind's stories, in the diary I still keep, carefully preserved, in a drawer in my own study now, no longer a secret waiting to be delivered, simply a record, finally believed, of exactly who she always was. I think, too, of the woman who kept a plain cream envelope safe for 15 years, waiting for the one day it could finally do the good it was always meant to do, and I understand now that patience, held with enough love and enough care, can outlast almost any lie, however carefully constructed, however long it's been believed. My mother waited 15 years to tell me the truth, because she understood, better than I did at the time, that the truth deserves to arrive somewhere solid, in the hands of someone finally strong enough to hold it properly. I like to think I proved her right. Thank you for staying with me through Verity's story. If it leaves you with one thing, I hope it is this: the truth does not need to arrive quickly to arrive completely, and it does not need revenge attached to it in order to matter. Gather what you find carefully. Believe the people who were never given the chance to be believed while it counted. And when the truth finally does arrive, meet it with patience and dignity rather than fury, because what you build afterward will always outlast whatever you might have burned down instead. If someone in your own life was never properly believed, let this be your reminder that it is never too late to believe them now, even after they are gone. If this story stayed with you, there are more like it waiting. Until next time, protect your own peace first, and let the quiet, patient truth always have the final word.